Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next in our series of webinars for clinical monitors on risk-based monitoring. This is one of my favorite lessons. This is on lessons learned. And when I give talks about risk-based monitoring, one of the things that people always appreciate is that we share what we've learned when we implement risk-based monitoring. And so I'm sharing that with you today. So let's get started. For those of you, many of you have been participants with us throughout these webinars, but in case you're new to our webinar series, I just wanted to explain why MANA RBM. Why are we providing these webinars? Our team has been focused on the principles of both RBM and remote trial management for more than 10 years. My background is I'm a physician. I've been a PI at the National Institutes of Health, a VP at GSK, and Chief Medical Officer at two technology companies. I'm trained and was boarded as in both pediatrics and pediatric endocrinology. My team and I have developed and implemented the entire process for risk-based monitoring for multiple sponsors. We've also completed a knowledge transfer to a sponsor. We've developed and published competencies for site monitors. We've published on electronic investigator site files, remote informed consent review, and reports for risk-based monitoring. So we are excited to be here with you today and to provide this webinar. The training webinars are designed to help monitors to adopt the principles of risk-based monitoring and to begin the process of self-training. One of the things I learned in my training is that you have to continually teach yourself. So what we wanted to do is to give you a base of knowledge that will allow you to continue to advance the principles of risk-based monitoring. And we also want to build a cadre of trained monitors that can implement risk-based monitoring. We passionately believe that risk-based monitoring can enhance clinical trial quality, and so we're eager to do that and drive adoption of risk-based monitoring. So this is the fourth in the series. Each of these webinars is going to be posted on our YouTube channel, MANA Risk-Based Monitoring. You can subscribe today and know when we update with new materials. We'll be providing videos throughout the year. Also, if you follow us on MANA RBM on Google+, then you'll also be notified of neat new things that come up as well. So stay tuned. We hope to provide lots of useful information to help the industry. Now, just to give you, again, an overview and a background, this risk-based monitoring training program is designed to help you to understand risk-based monitoring, the principles, the goals, and how to achieve those goals. And then for each webinar, we give you some specific learning objectives. So for today, what we want you to be able to do is to describe the importance of lessons learned and continuous improvement in risk-based monitoring. I think that's one of the things that you'll see is that it is an iterative process, and so each time you do it, you should improve on your processes, you should improve on what you learn, and we want you to also identify how these lessons learned can enhance your process development, and as well as for you to describe how the monitor would use lessons learned in current practices. So lesson one, include process and technology approach in your site feasibility activities. So one of the things that I see over and over again is that the sponsor is really excited. They want to implement risk-based monitoring, but the people that are doing the site feasibility are completely separated from the people that are doing the implementation of risk-based monitoring. So when the sites finally get selected, they know nothing about risk-based monitoring, about the use of technology, and they're blindsided. So one of the things that we think is very important is to set expectations during that site selection and feasibility process so that the sites know that you're going to use technology, what the expectations are going to be for them, how they're going to, what kind of internet access they're going to need to be able to provide, what kind of expectations the sites might have for support, as well as budget, because all of these will affect budget as well. So let's talk a little bit about site expectations. So for eSource, as you know, we've talked about that. That's where the site will collect data directly on an electronic data collector. Usually it's a tablet, as this gentleman has, and there is no transcription. So when the study coordinator sees the subject, they enter the data directly on the eSource tablet. Sometimes you can use, and we have used an EDC system as eSource. The difference really is that we collect additional information to support good clinical practice, documentation of protocol compliance, and we include those on the data collector. So that's a little bit different than the way you're used to seeing with EDC. For these to work, unless you have an eSource tablet that has offline capabilities, and there are those that are out there, you need to make sure that you have adequate wireless internet. There's nothing worse than for the study coordinator to be seeing a subject and the tablet freezes or doesn't work. So it's really important that they have very good internet, and I'm sure you know, but the more people that are using a wireless internet, the slower it goes. So that's another piece to look at. And then if you're using EDC, which most of you will be doing, it's the importance of having rapid data entry. As we've talked about throughout risk-based monitoring webinars, is that one of the big differences is that you want the sites to enter the data as quickly as possible so you can begin review as quickly as possible. You also want to know what technical support is available to the site. So do they have to call somebody in? We had one sponsor, in fact, that only had a tech guy once a week. So all of these things you have to make sure that you understand and that you have contingency plans for. The other thing that we like to do in the pre-study visits is to test access. So to have the electronic systems up from a demo system so that you can go in and make sure that there are no firewall issues when you're, for them to be able to access the systems. And this is particularly important if you're working in academic sites. The other piece as part of the site expectation is the site regulatory binder. So as you guys who have been on many of these webinars know, that we really strongly recommend the use of an electronic investigator site file. And that means that the site must use the EISF as a reg binder. That means they need to have a multi-page scanner to be able to take paper documents and to certify them as electronic copies. The site may destroy the paper copies after the documents they've made their certified electronic copy, but it really depends on the site's SOPs. So understanding that is important as well. The other piece that the sites need to understand is how are you going to protect and store personal health information, both within the eSource and also within the EISF. One of the things that we feel strongly about is that informed consents should be reviewed remotely much faster than they are now, because we often find problems with the ICF. So it's really, we think this is an important and another expectation to set with the sites. The other thing that we hear, so I was at a risk-based monitoring program in not last year, but the year before, and one of the, there was a site member there, and their concern was that if the monitors don't come out to the site frequently, then who's going to support them and make sure that they do the study right? So one of the things that they need to understand is, although there won't be a monitor at your site as often, the monitor will actually be there and available more rather than less, because the monitor is not going to be on the road as much. And so they will get the support that they need. And one of the ways we do that is by setting up weekly calls with the study coordinator, as well as monthly calls with the PI. Another comment that was mentioned at one of the RBM conferences was that it can be very problematic if you need to speak to other members of the study staff at the site and you don't pre-schedule that. So for instance, if you need to talk to the pharmacy, make sure that you have that scheduled as part of your weekly visit. for the visit that you need to talk to the pharmacy staff, or if you need to talk to the regulatory person, so that the monitor isn't spending her time that she has scheduled with the study coordinator isn't spending the time she has scheduled with the monitor going around to find the right people to be part of the call. And the other thing that we've received a lot of very positive feedback is that the sites can expect much faster feedback. And what that means to them is that they won't make the same mistake as many times. They won't have to make as many corrections. And everyone wants to do it right, so that if they know that you're looking at that data right away and that you're providing feedback to them right away, then that is another positive benefit to adopting this methodology. Finally, when you're having that discussion with the site as part of site feasibility, is to discuss budget. So one of the things that we think is the most important is adequate training, which we'll talk about later, but adequate training at the beginning of the study, at study initiation. So we usually like to have 2 days rather than one. And when you explain to the site why, and that not everybody has to be involved the whole time, but that the initiation team must make sure that each of the different people that are going to be using technology know how to use it, that everybody's been trained on using the source, that you've seen that they know how to use it. All of these things take more time. So making sure that the site sees that the budget is going to include that additional time, that's really important. And also that they recognize that it's going to be your expectation that that people are available for that extra time on the initiation visits. But we think, frankly, that the time spent on the initiation visits face to face is so important, because that's where you're building your relationship with the sites. That's where they know who you are, so they're comfortable calling you when they have questions or problems. And that it's much better money spent than on a large investigator meeting where the people that are really going to be doing the work are usually not at the meeting. So we think this is really an important piece. Lesson number 2, risk assessment process is critical. So as many of you know, I was in Florida for the first month of this visit, and these are the treasures of the Etosha. So a fellow named Mel Fisher believed that he could find this treasure in the ocean, and he spent years searching for the treasure, and ultimately did find it. But he would never have found it if he hadn't gone looking for it. And that's what I want you to realize, is that you aren't going to find the errors if you don't go looking for them, if you don't know what you need to look for. So this risk assessment is absolutely critical, because everything you do follows this activity. So you cannot leave this out. So for instance, when you think about randomization, if someone isn't carefully looking at the randomization process, whether it's electronic, whether it's in the IVR, doesn't matter. If you're not looking to make sure those assignments are working correctly, then you might have something like this. Dr. Stevens' understanding of randomization wasn't quite up to scratch. So he would come out of his consultation room and point to somebody, and that was who got the treatment. So again, what we're trying to do is say these are really important activities, is to think about who's going to look at these activities, and that things like randomization are a very, very big risk, because everything follows from that. Those of you who've been watching the news know that in early January, that was reported that there was a phase 1 trial where there were significant morbidity and mortality from an investigational drug. And this isn't the first time this has happened. In 2006, a similar thing happened in London with another immunomodulatory drug. And as they did, well, from a medical standpoint, you call it a morbidity and mortality conference, but as you do the assessment of what went wrong, one of the things they realized is that there were a number of things that happened at the site, whether it was the rate of infusions, whether it was people understanding how to recognize basically an immune storm. These are the kinds of things that if you don't think about them up front, then people don't know what to look for, and that's where you have problems. So as we've talked about, there is risk assessment at the protocol level. There's risk assessment that's also being done by the study team in managing the entire study. And because we have many people on our webinars, the site also has an activity. So does the site know what to expect? Have you been trained on what's in the investigator brochure? Do we know what the expected adverse events are? Do we know how the drug is supposed to be given or administered, or the device? All of these things. So each of these levels, there needs to be a risk assessment activity. So let's go through it a little bit just to remember this. So from a protocol development standpoint, one of the things that we've learned is that if input from the sites but both the study coordinator and the PI is very useful. So this is where you can make a protocol much easier to administer, even things like who is going to admit the subject, or who is going to see the subject, when are the assessments, are there logistics that are going to be important, how, for instance, one that we see a lot because we do vaccine trials is that the time frame for follow-up of a subject, say after a vaccination, is often very short. It's only 1 or 2 days, and it's thought to be very easy. Oh, the study coordinator will contact the subject. Well, it usually takes 4 to 5 calls to reach that subject. So when you have a lot of subjects, when you have a very short timeline, you're automatically raising the risk of being able to do that, maintain protocol compliance. So what we want to do is to modify the protocol as much as we can, keeping the scientific principle in mind, but modify it to remove the risk as much as you can. And then once you've got that protocol finalized, then what you do is you need to look at all of those critical high risk areas and determine how you're going to look at that. So do we have the fields in the eSource or EDC that will allow us to really measure what we need to do? Do we have reports designed that we need to use? Again, the reports don't do any good if you haven't collected the data. And that's why this risk assessment drives how you design your data collectors, including both the EDC, ePro and diaries, any other kinds of third-party vendor data that you might have. And then from that, we develop what we call data and document review guidelines, because that document, which is used across all of the different functional groups within the study, defines who's going to look at what and when. And therefore, we know that we have all of the high-risk areas covered. And then from a site implementation standpoint, develop processes or training to address the high-risk areas. So, for instance, if this is a drug that has to be infused using a pump, are you going to implement some steps to make sure that that pump rate has been set properly, that you have the right infusion bag, for instance, or whatever it is, that you're able to maintain the blind? Is this a product that the placebo and the active drug may look different? All of these kinds of things you need to think about. And then at the site level, you need to determine how will you identify if these high-risk areas, if the plans are not met. So what is your QC process around that? So this is why this activity is so important to everything that you do. Lesson 3, sponsors should modify their budget model and their timelines. So let's go through this a little bit more. So some of the budget things that you want to think about is, as we said, there needs to be more site training. So you need to plan time for remote calls as well as visits. As I look at RFPs for studies, so often all the monitoring that's listed is how many on-site monitoring visits do you need? And that is the exact opposite of what you need to do. You need to think about what monitoring needs to happen, how much time per subject, and then how much time do you need to have visits with the study coordinator? How much time do you need to have visits with the PI, how much time do you need to have team meetings to go over the findings that you have? So the time is often the same, but it's spent not in traveling, but in really doing that activity of quality oversight of the study. So it's really important that you look at the way you do your budget, because that's going to be very different. The other thing is that you should expect some timeline changes. So startup, for instance, if you're going to use an electronic investigator site file, you want to start that at the time that you're starting your site identification, because you want every document that comes in to be filed for those sites. And if the sites don't end up being in the study, that's fine. You've collected that data and you have it all maintained. So the idea that all of your reg documents get put automatically, immediately into the electronic site investigator site file saves everybody a huge amount of time. Also, when you're setting up studies, if you have multiple different electronic systems, you need to set up time for making sure that those systems are working together, whether it's data transfers from a lab into an EDC or whatever it is you want, or if it's the IVR system going in, you want to make sure that you have time to get each of those systems set up and that you then test those systems working together. So let me show you what I mean. Let's just say one of the things that we really like to do is we hate duplicate databases. So if the data is in one place, we want it only in one place. And this is part of the eSource guidance that we talked about. So if the data for the IVR, let's just say a subject gets seen, their inclusion exclusion is completed in the EDC, everything's in the EDC, and then you want to randomize that subject. If you're going to use a separate IVR system, that's fine. But what you want is you want to avoid having the coordinator have to call in, provide the information separately, and then get information and hand enter it in here. As much as possible, you want to make this one or two way so that you can make sure that the data that the IVR system needs is coming from the EDC system. And that way you save a tremendous amount of time with reconciliation at the end, and you make it much less likely to have errors because you're having an electronic transfer of data rather than a transcription of data. That takes a little bit more time up front, but you save that time at the end when you don't have to do reconciliation. Same way with labs. Some people want the labs to go into the EDC system. We'll show you another option in a minute too, but let's just say it's patient diary. You want that data to come into the EDC system. Again, you want to set this up so that the data you have a data interchange and that it isn't hand entering data and transferring data. So remember that you need more upfront time, less time for reconciliation. It means you have to work across companies, and that's often a challenge for some project managers. And also you must have a common data dictionary. And this sounds crazy, but it's simple things like how many places is the site number? Is it 0101? Is it 101? Is the subject number? If you have a randomization number, making sure that these systems all have that same expectation for the number of places, that is, whether it can be a numeric field or an alphanumeric field, meaning it can have both letters and numbers. All of these things really need to be defined because that's the way you make sure that the systems can talk appropriately to each other. And then in addition, you need to do this cross-system testing. So the upfront time, you want to recognize that, but that time is saved in many different ways. So for instance, we did a study that all completely paperless study, and we had to do a web services interface between the IVR, which was collecting subject data, as well as doing randomization into an eSource system. And it did take more time up front to get that set up, but in the end, we had no reconciliation to do between the two systems. And we were able to go from last patient, last visit to final results in less than 2 weeks. So this is why you want to do this work up front, because it does save you and eliminates errors, which is important. So also, one of the other things that we really, really like is the use of a clinical data repository. So as we talked about, we're really focusing on centralized oversight, and that means we need to look at lots of different kinds of data. And I think this idea that many companies have a repository, but those repositories are used specifically for analysis data. This is different. And the reason for it is that the analysis data is often modified into, it's called CDISC SDTM. So it's a certain format that's used to submit to the FDA. But it isn't useful when you're looking at data as a trial is going on. So we want to look at a lot of operational data. We want to look at queries. We want to look at audit trails, all of this kind of thing. And often that data is not easily accessible. So a data repository is not a data repository, is not a data repository. But what you'll see is we want all of this information coming into the repository so that we can combine data across these different data sets and look for errors, look for making sure that studies are complying with either GCP or whatever. So for instance, something like we collect data on study personnel training records. That way we can check to make sure each study person has received the right training and that you have the documentation of that training. Same way with IP management. We want to be able to run reports that look at how much drug should still be at the site, from how much was received versus how much has been dispensed, so that we can, again, do some reconciliation remotely. So when you set this up, we like to set up automated imports as much as possible, but it's not required. We want to map the data to existing reports that we've designed. And then we set up custom reports for high-risk data elements and the SPAR. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about this next week or in 2 weeks. But each study then has, and sometimes it's at the program level, has specific reports that are for the high-risk areas. And we want to make sure that those get set up as well. So this can't happen until all of the other systems are finalized and you have test data in those other systems to be able to bring them in. So the timing of this entire process is again, an important piece to consider. Training is lesson number 4. And I probably can't say enough about it. You see this, as we've talked about, in 21 CFR Part 11. It's part of GCP, and it's the key to the successful implementation of your study. So as I told you about a study once we did that was all a paperless trial with eSource and EISF, the whole bit. Some of the sites were a little bit, they looked askance at us about whether we should do this because they were so used to developing their own eSource and their own source documents, and they needed to know this electronic source the same way and that same depth as they did the paper source. But once they did, they could work much faster. So, taking the time to do that training is really important. Setting up, so this is all what we set up at the initiation visit. Set up of any technology at the site. If you just send it to the site and think it's going to be set up, when you go for an on-site monitoring visit, you're going to find whatever it is in a box in Susie's office. So it's really important that all this technology gets set up, that you make sure it's all working, so that we know that everybody is set up for success. We want, for the study coordinator and PI, if they're going to use eSource, we want to make sure that they can enter the data directly into the whatever it is, the data collector, that they know it, and that means using practice patients. So what we often do, we'll send practice patients to them to practice entering in the test environment. And then when we come out to do the initiation visit, we will pretend that we're a patient so that they can see, and you can see how well they know the source, how well they know the technology, and how well we know whether they take a tablet, a piece of paper, into the exam room rather than just take the tablet. So it's a big change to move from paper, and we need to reinforce that at every step. So for using the EISF, we want to make sure they know that the scanner is working, that they know how to upload, that they know how to make a certified electronic copy, and we want to make sure that that they understand the processes and timelines for review. So for instance, we expect the informed consents to be uploaded within 1 to 2 days so that we can begin to review those right away. So these are the kind of expectations in the training that you want to set up at the very beginning. One of the other things that we learned is that when we went to a paperless approach and we went to electronic source, and we told the certain monitors that they weren't going to do any SDV, they didn't know what to do. They did not know how to review the data if they didn't do SDV. So what we're doing as part of this training, and what we do when we train monitors, is to teach them how to do source data review. And that's one of the February webinars, and I really recommend that you come to that. And how to use all the technology systems. So one of the things that we often find is that the training on the technology systems for the monitors is rudimentary. It's not nearly as extensive as the training for the site. But the monitor is the first person that the site calls. So one of the things that we like to do is make sure the monitor has to enter patients too, that they have to try a patient that's a premature discontinuation, that they know how to enter adverse events, that they know all of these pieces, because they're going to have to be the first step in helping the site. So we think that that's a really important piece. We also want to teach the monitors how to do root cause analysis. So if we find issues, the site monitors are the link to the sites. And so they need to understand, how do they figure out when a problem occurs, why it occurred. And then once they figure out why it occurred, what do they need to do to fix it, and how are they going to check to see that it is fixed. So this is a really important component, and as well as remote site management. So we use a central monitor, but the site monitor is the one that presents the progress reports to the site. And so it's really important that they know how to read the reports, understand them, and can provide that input back to the principal investigators. We also teach them how to do remote informed consent review and management of regulatory documents remotely as well. Team training. So we've talked about site training, we've talked about monitor training. Now let's talk about team training. So team training should be, first of all, that everyone should know the principles of risk-based monitoring. But then you should, on top of that, talk about protocol-specific training so that you make sure, and this goes back to this idea of data and document review guidelines. So it teaches each group, so you understand what the data managers are looking at, what the site monitors are looking at, what the medical monitors are looking at. We want to make sure everyone understands what the high-risk data element and processes are, who's going to be looking at them, how are you going to communicate when you find something, how is the team going to come together and discuss what needs to be done. We have a white paper on our website, and one of the things that we think is really important in that is that it talks, each kind of bit of information you get may have a different meaning to different members of your project team. And so it's really important that you're not working in silos, that you're working as a team together, because it's really that cross-functional review and communication that's so important for the successful implementation of risk-based monitoring. All right, lesson number 5, plan for revisions and optimization. So one of the things that as you read the guidance documents is that risk-based monitoring is designed to incorporate continuous improvement. So you don't set a plan, and you follow that plan no matter what happens, no matter what falls apart, no matter you set your CRFs and you stick with them no matter what. You set your protocol and you stick with it no matter what. That is not the approach with risk-based monitoring. So what we want to do is we want to look at, can a large number of queries be explained with either education or modification of the data collector? And I was at an SCDM, chaired an SCDM session this last year, and this was brought up by one of the speakers, is that they plan to make at least one revision into their data collectors in a trial, because as the trial gets going and you start to see things that are not working particularly well, if you can optimize those, then in fact you're going to help out the trial tremendously, and you're going to eliminate monitoring. You may be eliminating queries, you may be eliminating deviations. It's really important to think about that. And in fact, you'll hear us talk a lot about the SPAR, which is our subject profile analyzing risk. And this is what we talk about to do source data review. But we design them, and then oftentimes we go, oh, we wish we had an additional field in that would really help us to be able to identify something that we're now having to go back and look other places for. So we want to be able to continually improve these, because that's improving the quality of the trial. Are there aspects of the protocol that can be enhanced to eliminate deviations? That's a really important one. Are you finding deviations that really you don't think affect the trial progress, but they're deviations? So can you modify your protocol to affect that? And the other thing is that oftentimes there's lots of different ways to use an electronic system. And so once the sites are used to using, used to the study, have enrolled a few subjects, oftentimes it's good to check in with them and see if there are ways, are there specific things that are kind of clunky to them? Are there shortcuts that you can help them with? If you give them all that up front, sometimes it's too much. So it's oftentimes good to let them get started and then go back and revisit with them. Is there anything we can do to help with the process flow? Is there anything that's frustrating you that we might be able to help you with? So I think those are all things to think about. As I showed you earlier about the repository, we believe that a data repository is very, very valuable for risk-based monitoring. It isn't the only thing, and you can't just have a repository and reports and think you're going to be able to do risk-based monitoring. But it does help because you're bringing data in from lots of different sources. And oftentimes, as you'll see when we talk about source data review, the data visualizations can be really, really powerful in helping you do your oversight. The other thing that we designed are what we call our site level forms. So we try to think from the very beginning, what's the data that we're going to want to review, that we're going to want to run reports on, and how are we going to get that data? And what we found is that oftentimes there's a lot of data that may sit in a CTMS system. It probably sits in paper. And if we could get that set up so that we could use it electronically, we could have an audit trail, we could get reports on it, we could get notifications of specific things. So what we've done is to really think about how can we design what we call them our site level forms to allow us to do better review of what's going on. So as we said, from the repository standpoint, what I really love is being able to bring data in from lots of different systems. So whether it's from the labs, and that way you don't have to do an integration. So whether it's labs, whether it's ePro, whether it's central ECG, whether it's specialized raters, all of that information, if you can bring that all into a repository, then you can compare maybe the way a subject looks at is giving a rating compared to what an investigator is. You can look at the data in a much more comprehensive way. And that's the way we do our standard RBM reporting and site performance. And it allows us to bring the data in to do source data review across lots of different data sources, but we normalize that data. And you'll hear more and more about normalization so that you can compare it and you're not having to look at start and stop dates on a long piece of paper, which many people are doing. So sometimes there are a lot of companies out there that are selling a reporting tool, but remember, that's not enough. So they show you fancy reports and they say, oh, this is great. You've got these beautiful reports, but what you may not appreciate is that there has to be data mapping and oversight. So when the data comes in, you need to make sure that it's in the right format. You need to make sure that it's coming in. So you can't just have a reporting tool and expect to be successful. And as I said, we use our site level forms to do a lot of other kind of oversight. So it lets us do oversight of training. It lets us do the delegation of authority. It allows us to check things on monitoring reports. And as I mentioned, the data are different than that in the SDTM format. So it's really important when your senior management goes, we have a repository. We already have a place where the data goes, that you can explain to them that this is different and the way you're using it is different, and it is important to be able to have access to the data in more granularity than you do in SDTM. So let me see. So as we said here, what we do is we like to bring all of these different reports in, and then we have standardized reports, but we also then do customized reports specific for that trial or that program. Now, the reports are standardized, but some of the things you may not think about and some of the systems don't have is you want to be able to do ad hoc reporting, because you can never think of all the things that you need to know, that you need to have reports on. Something will come up, somebody will ask a question, so you want to be able to do ad hoc reporting. You also want to be able to have what's called drill down capabilities, and that means when you find something funny, you can go back and drill down into the data and see what the data actually says. And this is how you're often able to enhance reports, you're often able to find problems. Another thing is role-based access. So we talked a little bit about that in the first technology webinar, but with this it says, you know, who can have access to maybe to certain reports. And the other thing is you want to be able to look at data across time, because you want to be able to see, as you're looking at site performance, you want to be able to see how the site's doing across time, across a number of different types of reports or metrics. One of the things people ask me is, why not use Excel? And the answer is, you can use Excel. But there's a few things you need to know. You have to rebuild the reports every time. So you aren't able, when you set up, if you go back to a repository, you can set up a report, and then when new data comes in, those reports are all updated with the new data. When you do Excel, you have to build those reports again. So you aren't able to reuse, and and often there's significant data manipulation. But it can be done. So in the SCDM program that this year, there was a gentleman, Adam Beauregard from Canada, who had done that. And this is his paper in Applied Clinical Trials, if you want to read it. But he said, again, for that trial, it worked out for them, very low cost. And so that if your choice is, do I use Excel or not do it, you use Excel. So the idea is that it's not great, but it is an option, and it depends on your trial and the size of your trial, and we've done it with Excel as well. So the point is, you really have to think about what the needs are for your specific trial. Sorry, we're jumping ahead quickly. Lesson 7. This is a change in mindset as well as a working practice. So one of the things that we realize is that we have to remind people over and over and over again to get rid of paper. And you know that you have to reinforce it at every step. And you have to continually remind people, you don't need to do that in paper. That's why we have electronic systems. And another piece is to have that technology, as I mentioned earlier about the EISF, have that ready from the very beginning, because if you don't get started in paper, then you don't have to convert. And what people get frustrated about is they've got everything in paper, and now they have to do extra work to move it into the electronic system. So what we want to do as much as possible is work with the electronic systems from the very beginning. And, depending on the age, some of our younger monitors laugh and go, I can't believe the way everything is in paper. And we tell them, yeah, that's the way the industry started. And many of the even processes we have are still vestiges of working in paper, even back in collecting the data in paper. So it is an evolution, and you do have to remind people, but it isn't always age. So we have found some coordinators who, once they got comfortable with the technology, loved it and didn't want to go back. So I think it's important to realize that it is a process. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's a mindset. Review existing tools and processes. So some of the kind of horror stories that we've heard. For instance, there was a study where the sponsor had decided that they wanted to do less SDV. Everybody agreed, but when they got to database lock, the SOP for the data management group was that they had to have 100% SDV. So, it was a real conflict because the monitors didn't want to say they did 100% SDV because they didn't, and they had to have that to do the database lock. So remember, look at your existing processes and make sure that you're not setting yourself up for failure. There are ways around it. You can do study-specific processes so that you can make sure that you don't have that happen. But these are the kind of things that can really derail your project for no good reason. So it's really important to look at this. So, many people start with a kind of standard monitoring plan. Your monitoring plan is going to have to change over time. And one of the things that we've gone to, because we're working on this cross-functional approach, is that the monitoring plan doesn't define specific intervals for certain reviews. We use the data and document review guidelines because that works across all the functional groups, as opposed to having a monitoring plan have some things in it, the data management plan having some other things in it. So and does your monitoring plan address remote review? Because if you've been using a standard one that talks about 100% SDV, you're going to have to redo it. And how will you manage that review across functional groups? Oftentimes that's the part of the startup, is to make sure everybody understands that you know what's going on. Do you have an issue management system, and does it incorporate a root cause analysis, remediation, and confirmation of changes? That's a critical piece because this is a really important part. And if you don't have that, you can develop it, but that's an important piece you need to set up front. And another thing are monitoring reports. So, monitoring reports, a lot of people have taken a paper monitoring report and made it electronic. And they have their SOPs around that too. But oftentimes, electronic may mean it's just a PDF as opposed to being able to be searchable. It may be that they take a lot of data that has to be entered into the monitoring report that's available other places. So in electronic systems, you already know what the enrollment is. You already know what the screen failure is. You already know what the number of SAEs are. So do you really need to re-enter all that information again into the monitoring report with the risk that it's not going to be accurate? So it is important to think about how you're doing these existing things and think, is this going to work for me, and do I need to modify that? Lesson 9, RBM does not have to increase costs. So some people thought at the beginning that RBM was going to greatly decrease costs, and I think it can decrease costs, but it doesn't decrease them as much as you think because you are doing more monitoring. You're just doing it remotely. The other thing is that you can use a variety of data collection tools. Some are very expensive, some not so much. And you have to think about what you need for your trial to decide what tool is the best. As I mentioned, the EISF and ETMF can save significant time and oftentimes can be administered by a CTA instead of a monitor. So that saves a lot of time as well. Pass-through costs can be significantly decreased. You can really eliminate both printing and shipping costs, so there's a big chunk. And you can make a huge savings in your travel costs because you're now going to do more of this remotely. And if you use integration, then you can eliminate much of your reconciliation costs and the time at the end of the study when you want to do that. So it's not straightforward, but I think over time, as we develop more and more tools, we can do it more efficiently. So let's look at some of the things. What we've done is we've developed some lower cost approaches, mainly to help companies to be able to adopt RBM without spending a huge amount of money. But some of these may work well for some trials and may not work well for others. So sometimes you're going to need to use higher cost solutions as well. Again, it depends on your specific need as to what's going to be important. So you have to think about what you want to do. You have to think about whether you want more of it done by the technology, or do you want more of, or are you going to be okay with more manual work? Usually the lower cost systems may require more manual work than the electronic ones, and so you have to kind of balance that. And finally, lesson 10. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If I've learned anything and heard anything from the people who have implemented RBM, and we agree with this 100%, is that RBM is an iterative process. And you have to start somewhere, and you will continually improve and continually redesign your processes to make them more efficient and to work better for you. But if you wait for perfect, you'll never get started, and then in fact, you'll be farther behind. And so don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Get as much as you can done, and on each successive trial, try to expand on that. Because each study is going to tell you what lessons learned, what you can do to make it better, and allow you to enhance your process. And keep that mindset of continuous improvement so that you learn from your mistakes, you improve your processes, whether it's learning from the mistakes the sites make, learning from the mistakes the monitors make. The important thing is to recognize that everybody makes mistakes, and how can we learn from them, because then we do a much greater service to the industry and to the research subjects that participate in our trials. So, in summary, remember, include process and technology approach in your site feasibility. You're going to end up with much more prepared sites. Risk assessment process is critical. If you start anywhere, start with that. And remember that you should modify your budgets, both the budgets for the site, but also the budgets for the trials. And it should not be on just monitoring visits. Training, training, training. Remember, spend the time, think about the training, go back to more training if you're not getting what you need. You need to train the sites. You need to train the study team. Everyone needs to have training. Plan for revisions and optimizations. When you have to do whether it's an amendment, a modification to your data collector, those are being done to make it easier for your study sites, to make fewer deviations from your protocol. So remember, this is something that can really help you to enhance the quality of your trials. A data repository with data visualizations is a valuable addition, and it is different than the data warehouses that are used for analysis data. This is a change in mindset as well as working practice. So we are moving from technology, from paper to technology, and that's a change for everybody. And so we want to make sure that we have to keep reminding each other that we need to call each other when we make mistakes, and we need to make sure to support the teams as they make this change to different methods, different tools. Review your existing processes to make sure that you don't have anything that's going to get in the way of your successful implementation, whether it's making sure your database lock doesn't require 100% SDV documentation. Each of these kinds of processes you have to think about so that you don't find yourself blindsided and not able to do what you want to do. RBM adoption does not have to increase cost, and in some situations it does decrease cost. So I think it really depends on the trial, depends on the tools you use, but it is an enhanced method. And finally, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. It's much better to get started. It's much better to identify in your documentation that you needed to change a process because it wasn't working well. This shows that you're paying attention and that you're trying to improve and do the very best job for your study coordinators, for your subjects, for your sponsors, for everybody. So thank you very much. If you want, again, this is just a reminder, if you want, we have a lessons learned on SurveyMonkey. If you want to add your lessons learned, please do. And if you want to take a competency, here's the URL for that. And here are the upcoming webinars that we have in February. And if you have other things that you think we should cover, please let us know. Thanks very much. We really appreciate your participation and then look forward to seeing you next week.